What's going on, guys? It's Brandon. I just want to talk to you guys about your relationships and value exchange. So I was talking to my friend and we were really breaking down this experience. We were spending some time together. I was hanging out at his house, and I always try to think about how I can add value to people in their lives, right? And most of the time, if you're that type of person, hopefully a lot of the times you're attracting people who are similar. They want to give value to you. They want to receive value from you. That's how a good relationship works, right? There's an element of utilitarian exchange, whereas there is some reason that you're in a relationship with somebody, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship or a business relationship. And so one of the things that became really interesting to me was to think about, how do you show up and perceive the value that you're giving other people? I'm in Colorado, in Estes Park. It's snowing. It's beautiful. It's amazing. One of the most amazing, beautiful drives in the country. So I'm constantly thinking about, what value am I providing this other person? What value can I get from them? And also, what value can I provide to them? And, we were having this conversation, and it really occurred to me that, just because I think something is valuable for somebody else doesn't necessarily mean that it's valuable for them, right? So in order to understand what somebody truly values, you have to understand what it is that they are interested in, what it is they truly value. And so they may not value the things that you value in the same way, right? It's an interesting concept, right? I'm sure you've all met people who are in relationships. They feel like they're giving and the other person is just taking and taking, or there's no reciprocation. And then you find out from the other person that, maybe they don't want to receive what that person's giving, right? And so it creates a question of, if this person feels like this is how they can add value and the other person doesn't perceive the value, it becomes difficult for there to actually be an exchange of value in that relationship or in that transaction, right? So it begs the question, how well do you understand other people? How well do you have the conversations and communicate what you find valuable, what is valuable to you, and then what is valuable to other people, so that your relationships can operate on a higher level of exchange? This is something that is really important to understand, because other people may not perceive what you're giving them as valuable the way that you're perceiving it as valuable. And on the contrary, maybe there are some things you do or give in a relationship that you don't perceive as valuable, but the other person does. And so it's really important to understand in relationships how to communicate, how to have the conversation around the value exchange, how to have a conversation around what you value, what you want from the relationship, what you're willing to give in the relationship, and also what the other person is willing to give and what they value. Relationships can be complicated. It doesn't have to be, but sometimes they are. And a lot of times when there's complications in a relationship, it typically means that there are growth areas for both people, right? Biblically speaking, the Bible says iron sharpens iron. And what that means is that if two people who are really smart, really bright, start having a conversation and they're lacking agreement in some place, or maybe they feel like, the value exchange isn't the way that it should be, what happens is a lot of times there's emotions come up. There's other relationships, past relationships, maybe other relationships that were less valuable, or or relationships that were more based on taking instead of value exchange or fair exchange, or where one person decided to give more than the other, something to that effect, right? So what happens is sometimes someone can get triggered about those past situations, and it brings in a feeling of resentment, or brings in other emotions or things that are actually dampening the existing experience of the existing relationship. And so I started to think about all these things and was having a conversation with a friend of mine about this, and it became very apparent to me that one of the ways that I think in my life is that when something doesn't go my way, ultimately I'm responsible, right? I take full responsibility. The more responsibility that you can take, the more power that you have in your life. And so on the contrary, you see people who don't take responsibility for anything. They're constantly struggling, blaming, things don't work around them. Nobody wants to be around them, right? So, you have to look at and think about how you can be responsible for everything in your life, everything that happens, good or bad, your relationships, things that work out well, things that don't work out, and understand that in the process, when you run up against somebody and you're kind of like restimulating some of these imbalances in relationships, and you have that experience of, I feel like I'm giving too much, or the other person feels like they're giving too much and you're not providing enough value, or vice versa. That experience brings up a question of how well are you able to communicate? And like I said before, it is a growth point. So how committed are you to growing and improving in your relationships and in your own self, right? But if you're in a relationship or you're in a conversation and you think you have all the answers and you shut down your listening of someone else's point of view, then what happens is you basically give up the ability to have that relationship, because without communication, without the ability to agree on something, it becomes very difficult to have a conversation with someone. If you're both growth-minded in a relationship and you run up against something where you're both disagreeing on something and there's kind of this uncertainty of what does the other person value, if you're both willing to submit in a relationship that it's a growth opportunity for both of you to learn something, and you start to have a conversation out of curiosity and genuine interest and understand, what does this person find valuable, and actually care about the relationship, then what happens is you open up a growth opportunity for both of you in the relationship. But something else that happens sometimes is when somebody's not interested in doing that, it becomes very difficult to actually continue or be a part of that relationship or that conversation. So you see this all the time in, say, failed relationships, failed businesses, failed marriages, things like that, where there wasn't an ability to actually commit from both sides to commit to growth, to submit to this idea of discovering what the other finds valuable, despite thinking, you might think you're the most valuable person in the world. You might think you have all the answers. You might think you're the most intelligent person and everyone should listen to everything you say all the time, 100% of the time. But the reality is that's not going to happen with everyone you come in contact with. Part of that experience is understanding how to really listen to other people, how to understand how they think, how to understand what it is that they find valuable, why they're in the relationship or why they're engaging in business with you. And so that will give you a much better ground to stand on, where you can both hear each other out, you can both grow, you both learn something, and then you actually get a better outcome than maybe you thought was possible. And this is where, if you're really committed to your own success and to the success of people around you, that you can really start to get some serious results, because the average person is not willing to go there. And so what keeps people stuck in average is needing to be right, is wanting to be right, needing to be right, and refusing to see somebody else's point of view. And then what happens is, just like the prior conversation, is that you become disconnected from what the other person in the relationship feels is valuable and wants to experience out of that transaction, out of that relationship, out of that experience of you or another person. And so the failure or doom of relationships in that sense becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you want to avoid that, sometimes the hardest thing to do is just admit that you're wrong. And you may not be wrong, but you may be wrong in the moment where you're not allowing yourself to see another person's point of view or perspective. And that becomes extremely damaging when it comes to relationships, because we all live in this unique world. Everybody has a unique experience of life. Everybody has a unique experience of other people. Everyone has different levels of knowledge, skill sets, awareness, etc. And if we're not allowing other people to exist in their level of existence, their level of consciousness, their level of understanding, then, we're not just denying ourselves the opportunity to learn from that, but we're also denying them the opportunity to grow. And so in every relationship, there should be win-win. Everyone should be winning. Everyone should be growing and learning something. And we should all be providing value for each other in a way that lifts the tide, right? You guys have heard that saying, a rising tide lifts all ships. That's basically it. It should lift all the tides. We should really strive for a win-win experience in all areas of life, right? We should really strive to help other people, not to our own detriment, but in a way where, we gain while we're giving at the same time, So this philosophy of giver's gain is exactly that, where nobody loses, everybody wins, and there's just a constant elevation and a constant growth and a constant ability to improve. It seems a little idealistic maybe, But the reality is it's totally possible. And if you operate this way, people want to be around you, people want to do business with you, people want to be in relationships with you. The other thing that happens is when you start to operate this way, you'll start to be aware that there will come around people who just want to take and don't want to contribute, and they're not necessarily interested in what you find valuable. There does come a time when you need to express boundaries and understand where that line is for yourself so that you cannot be taken advantage of. But ultimately, you should also not allow those experiences to stop you from living in a way where you are operating out of a win-win, giver's gain mindset, because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where opportunities are created. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how you win.